Hey, it's me, Brent Lee. Okay, so on the 25th of October 2022, I hosted a live debate on Twitter Spaces between Professor Dolores Cahill and Dr. Graham Botley. You may know him as Swaledale Mutton. Originally, this was supposed to be a debate between Dr. Botley and an outspoken GP named Dr. Dave Cartland. But at the very last moment, while we were waiting on the line for Dr. Cartland to come on, this is what happened. Okay, we have both of our guests here tonight. Can you unmute yourselves?
Yep, unmuted.
Yeah, Dr. Cartland, can you press unmute? Hello? Dr. Cartland?
So, hello, my name is Professor Dolores Cahill, and Dr. David Cartland just asked me to make a statement that he just visited me in the last few days, and that he is a GP, and he thought that it, out of respect really for the qualifications of Dr. Graham Botley, that he asked me would I come in and engage in the debate with Dr. Botley in his place, if that's okay.
I'm happy with that.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
So, with Dr. Botley happy to continue, we did. I will present the actual debate in full, but first, as my audio was faulty on the recording, I'm just re-recording my intro so everyone can hear what the intended format was for this debate. And finally, I want to extend my gratitude and thanks to both speakers. I highly respect both for having the courage to defend their positions on a public forum in the face of adversity. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very special event. I am Brent Lee from the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy and Lads on Tour podcasts. I am very pleased to bring you this very much anticipated debate between Dr. Graham Botley and Professor Dolores Cahill. Before we start the debate, I'm going to explain the format and which topics my guests will be debating. All segments will be time limited. I will remind each speaker when their time is up and give them a few seconds to wrap it up. Our first topic is, are COVID vaccines safe for children? Dr. Botley will present his argument first for 3 to 5 minutes. Professor Cahill will then present her argument for 3 to 5 minutes. We will then proceed to an open discussion for 15 minutes where our speakers can challenge each other's presentation. Our second topic is SADS, S-A-D-S, Sudden Arrhythmic Death Syndrome. Professor Cahill will present her argument first. This will be for 3 to 5 minutes. And then Dr. Botley will present his argument, again for 3 to 5 minutes. We will then proceed to an open discussion for 15 minutes where our speakers can challenge each other's presentation. We will now move to our first topic. Are COVID vaccines safe for children? Dr. Botley, your argument.
Okay, well, when it comes to vaccines for children, we know from well over 200 years of using vaccines for children that they are essential to reduce childhood illness, childhood infirmity, and childhood death. And deaths were a major cause of childhood mortality, and vaccines have been one of the major impacts in reducing childhood mortality. Now, many people use this false argument that we overload pediatric immune systems with too many vaccines. Now, of course, we don't overload children's immune systems. Children's immune systems are challenged all day, every day, throughout their entire lives. And indeed, there is plenty of research to show that relatively constant exposure to pathogens, and I say that word advisedly, pathogens, actually helps the immune system develop in strength. Now, of course, infection comes with it a risk of illness, of long-term illness, of disease. And we've seen how things like Epstein-Barr virus are linked to multiple sclerosis. We've seen how HPV can lead to cervical cancer. And it is important to vaccinate children young. There is no point waiting until they're adults. There is no point waiting until they've already been exposed. We vaccinate young. We vaccinate healthy children to keep them healthy. There is no point waiting until they're ill. And the global use of these vaccines, and we will see this when the malaria vaccines come online, we know that the global use of these vaccines has drastically reduced childhood illness and mortality. And I think really that's all there is to say.
Professor Cahill, would you like to present 3 to 5 minutes?
Yeah, no, that's great. And thanks to Dr. Graham Botley for that. So I suppose the thing is, if a medical professional like a doctor engages in any medical treatment, whether it's for children or adults or pregnant women or anyone, the medical doctor has an obligation to first do no harm. So it's very simple. So if they're going to do any intervention, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So what we see with the so-called COVID-19 injections or vaccines, that normally a clinical trial with 1 death would be stopped. And we know that for people from middle age down, they have no risk for this particular COVID-19. And for example, in Ireland, we have a population in the Republic of 5 million. So I wrote in March 2020 to the Central Statistics Office, and the reply on the 5th of April 2020. So this would be at the end of the so-called flu season from November, December, January, February, March to the beginning of April. How many deaths were there in Ireland overall? And the Central Statistics Office said 0. So therefore, if there were going to be deaths, it would be in that period, and there weren't any. That's the first point, including children. And in Ireland, we have no deaths in children out of 5 million people. So then you have to say, if we are dealing with something that causes flu-like illness, is there prevention and treatment? Because these are what the doctors, when they're giving any kind of intervention. And of course, we know that vitamin D and vitamin C are the safest interventions in the world, and that they will protect everybody, including children. And of course, we have Nobel Prize winning ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine that's on the Nobel Prize, on the World Health Organization, safest medicine of the world. And both of those can be given safely to children and pregnant women. So we're talking about symptoms where children, it was well known even in 2020, because they have this immune system, they will not be affected by it. And out of 5 million people in the peak time, nobody died at all. And you can give vitamins D and C. So then the question is, if you were proposing a clinical trial, particularly with mRNA, the history of mRNA is that 0 of these were ever licensed following clinical trial because they cause so much harm and death and suffering in the animal studies, where in some of the studies, all of the animals died. And we know that in babies, where they were given this mRNA technology, that the babies some of them died. So therefore, the doctor has to weigh up in this particular instance, is it ethical to give an intervention where children are not at risk, where there are safest Nobel Prize winning treatments, if people have concerns, and using a technology where after decades of research, they actually caused death and harm in the animal studies and in the babies and children and everybody that took this technology. So doctors operate under the law, every interaction. So if you go for a surgery, you have to fill in an informed consent. So a clinical trial is even higher. And we know in the first week in December of 2020, from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th of December, the CDC reported that over 1,200 people in the first 5 days were reported with life-limiting adverse events within 5 days. So the question is, these clinical trials should have been stopped. There are over, on openVAERS.com, 30,000 reported deaths on these trials when they should be stopped with one death. And we know in the Pfizer study that 3 out of 4 pregnant women got pregnant following the injections. Their unborn babies died. So in the harm, we know that actually if you wear a white coat or not, whether you're a regulator or not, you cannot go around harming and killing people. And it is well known that for COVID-19, these medical interventions by medical doctors or whoever breaches the skin and injects the child is causing more harm than good. And that actually is unlawful and unethical and against all moral and ethical and the law and the Hippocratic Oath.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Butler, would you like to start the open discussion now for 15 minutes?
Yeah, so I mean, my first thing is I've been taking notes through all of that. And what I would have to say is every single thing that was said there is untrue. So if we break it down, there have been deaths in children.
Could you do one at a time for
no
Professor
problem.
to rebut?
So the first one I'll do then is the harm to children. So there's more than 100 children in the UK have died. So that is 100 too many from an easily vaccinatable disease. Secondly, it is a common fallacy that people think, oh, not many children have died, therefore they are not a risk. That is not true. And we know from quite significant amounts of research that we get, for example, CD19 downregulation. That's a B cell part of the immune system. So we also get Treg inhibition. So that's another part of the immune system. We know that there is immune damage from the infection, and that can be long lasting, and that then has a knock-on effect, very much like measles does on other infections. We see an increase in autoimmunity, an increase in cardiac damage, an increase in microclotting. We see neurological damage. A recent paper showed a significant increase in diabetes after COVID infection. So to say that children are not harmed is, I'm afraid, utterly untrue. So that's point one.
Well, maybe I think, the thing is Ireland has a population of 5 million, and it was well known in 2020 and 2021 that children were not affected by COVID-19. And so we have the figures in Ireland for 2020 and 2021 out of a population of 5 million. In those years, there was no children that died.
Well, the thing is that it is now 2022, and we know that there are these other harms. We know that there is immune system damage. We know that there is cardiac damage. We know that there is circulatory damage. We know that there is neurological damage. And you say a doctor should do no harm. Now, allowing a child to contract this infection does harm. It does. It cannot be disputed that the infection harms. It may not kill a high percentage of children, but when you have a very infectious virus that infects very large numbers of people very quickly, and you have such a wide-ranging sequelae of long-term symptoms, letting an infection rage unchecked is causing children harm. And so if your argument is that we should not give the infection because in theory it might cause harm, not giving the infection causes significantly more harm to those children.
So I suppose we have to look at, we're talking about, say in these, we're talking about something that gives flu-like symptoms.
No, it doesn't.
Generally this whole thing was initiated because they say that in the winter flu season 2019-2020, there was an issue of a so-called coronavirus, and the symptoms were flu-like illness. And in there was in the world, right, no children in those years. Now, it turns out because children have an immune system, it is well known that they never before were getting any kind of so-called influenza injections because children have it. And
no, children are vaccinated against flu.
In general, children were not, right? And it was well publicized and well broadcast, including in the media, that there was no, and including the World Health Organization and the European Union, in the flu season of 2019, 2020, and all of 2020, that children were not affected. And therefore there was none of the other measures. So we're talking about flu-like illness. And people develop an immunity. The coronavirus are part of the, if they exist, are the so-called causative agents of flu-like.
Well, what I would add firstly is that I have isolated the virus.
Because I have a consortium of 7 countries and 7 mass spectrometry labs. So we have, it's called the Integrity Project. And we're actually looking, because I've been in touch with Christine Massey, have written to 200 institutes in the world to provide it. So I will, and I'm delighted to say it publicly in this format, ask you to provide the sample, and we'll check it out with 7 internationally recognized labs.
Yeah. Well, we would to certain labs, certain collaborators. Unfortunately, someone like Massey, who I have dealt with before, I think needs professional help rather than rather than feeding her.
So anyway, I ran a class 3 and a class 4 biosafety lab, for many years. So these are, don't worry, they are the top labs in Australia and in Europe, and they all have the proper credentials. So we will be writing to you.
In that case, I probably work with them already. But anyway, so it is not a flu-like. It is not a flu-like illness. It may have initially, when it was first discovered, been thought to have been a flu-like illness. However, scientific research moves on. Scientific research finds new things out, and we know that there is a high level of autoimmunity. We know that the virus actively.
So wait a minute, just to clarify, are you saying this isn't a flu? Are you saying this agent doesn't cause the flu and it's not a flu?
It is not. No, it is completely different to an influenza virus.
So wait a minute, you're definitively saying that this coronavirus is not a influenza-causing virus. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is not an influenza-causing virus. It is nothing like an influenza-causing virus.
So the lockdown was not due to an influenza-causing virus. You're saying
it is called. The lockdown was in response to SARS-CoV-2, which is not an influenza virus.
Okay, because it has been classified in all of the classification systems. And they have it, broken down for the different infectious agents that cause flu-like symptoms for different times of the year. And coronavirus was known to cause, or at least it was in the literature for decades, to cause flu-like symptoms only between December and the end of March in the Northern Hemisphere. And then
but it hasn't been between those times. And the point is, you can insist.
That's all wrong, are you? You're saying that the immunology textbooks and things, that's all incorrect, that coronaviruses don't cause flu-like illness?
Because some of the symptoms overlap with flu. Are you saying that it has an influenza-like genome? Are you saying there is homology with influenza virus?
Not at all. No, listen, because you know what, I was the consortium leader of the PCR sequencing consortium in the world, right? And we got ethics approval across America. This was work done with Jack Lyons-Weiler. So we got ethics approval to DNA sequence all of the testing that was giving the diagnosis by PCR across America. And within 24 hours, when we got ethics approval, the CDC and the FDA stopped all PCR testing within 24 hours to not give us a sample.
They never stopped PCR testing.
They stopped PCR testing for SARS-CoV-2 on the 21st of July, 2021. And then any PCR testing that was sold after that date was allowed to be used for 4 months later. It was a class 1 recall by the CDC. And well, I tell you the reason is because once you DNA sequence, if the products in the PCR liquid are not a coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2, then the doctors and the CDC and the manufacturers are liable under the law, not just for manufacturing a test, but also for a false diagnosis.
Sorry, I mean you're veering way off. When you say you did DNA testing, you saying you did DNA testing on the virus?
DNA sequencing? No, we had the World PCR Sequencing Consortium with Professor Sin Lee and Dr. Jack Lyons-Weiler.
Yeah. The names are irrelevant. Are you saying that you did DNA sequencing on the virus?
No. What we were saying is we were.
So what did you do DNA sequencing on then?
So what we were saying is, so obviously people were doing PCR all over the world, but in America. And then they were saying that if they get this result, they were giving a diagnosis of COVID-19. So what we were doing is saying, okay, we now have ethics approval that whatever you're calling the PCR liquid, that people that are given, in the labs, that we will then ask for that liquid to be sent to the lab and that we will DNA sequence it to confirm what they are, right? Because the thing is,
can I just interrupt you there, please? Right. So, firstly, the term PCR liquid is completely meaningless in scientific terms. There is no such thing as PCR liquid. You can have a PCR sample.
Yeah. So I thought, I used to do 250,000 PCRs at the one time in the Max Planck.
Which puzzles me why you would use a term like PCR liquid that doesn't actually exist.
It happens in a solution because the temperature cycles through. So absolutely. I'm talking about the solution. The PCR, people listening might know it's in a small container, a microtiter plate, but there's a liquid solution and the temperature varies.
I'm fully aware. I've been doing it 30 years myself.
Sanger sequence all of the DNA or whatever the nucleotide sequences were in what they were calling a test.
Can I also make a comment, please, that you're going to have a real tough time DNA sequencing the SARS-CoV-2 virus, primarily because it's an RNA virus. So you cannot DNA sequence an RNA virus.
No, so we were offering to sequence the PCR tests that were giving the diagnosis of COVID-19.
Why would you do that? We know what the sequence of the product is because we know what the primers are.
No, well, what we were confirming was what was in the PCR testing and what the primers were. So you know what?
We know what's in there.
I ran a diagnostic company and co-founded it for 20 years. And my area of speciality was to check tests that were on the market. But
you seem really, really confused about how PCR works.
No, I'm not.
And therein lies the problem, because you're talking about DNA testing an RNA virus. You're talking about sequencing a short product that has to be a specific sequence, otherwise it wouldn't actually appear within the qPCR assay. You're also going to struggle, depending on the qPCR assay, to actually sequence that, because you tend to get fluorescence integration into the product, and that will interfere with the sequencing reaction. Now, again, anyone who works, can I just finish? Anyone who works.
Can I just say this was done by Professor Sin Lee, who's one of the world leaders, right? So what we're doing is in full-length Sanger sequencing, right?
So at the Sanger, are you saying you did it at the Sanger Center?
No, so there's a method, right? So I know I've met the Nobel Prize winner, Ed Sanger, and he won a Nobel Prize for a technique, and it's called Sanger sequencing. And what that does is all of the nucleotides in any solution can be sequenced using full-length Sanger sequencing. So what we would
fully aware, yes.
Yeah, so but just for the people listening is that then you test the positive control, the negative control, what the primers are, and all of the nucleotides in the solution And then you check what they are confirming is the coronavirus. But of course, if it exists, and what we can do, of course, and
it does exist, yeah. As I told you, I've isolated it.
You know the swabs that the people take that goes into the liquid, that of course we can also, when we would have, is checked what was on the swabs that the people use. So every step of the entire procedure would have been using the Sanger sequence methodology. And just so you know, PCR, you have a template if it's RNA. And then once you do one cycle of PCR, the first cycle you have RNA strand, DNA strands, but then you go on and do the PCR with the DNA.
So, sorry, are you trying to explain reverse transcription?
No, because you said that I wouldn't be, you cannot do DNA sequencing on RNA, but of course PCR is DNA by the time you come to sequence it. Yeah, so you are wrong.
But you seem to not understand that you have to reverse transcribe first your RNA into DNA.
That's what I just said.
Are you not aware of that?
No, listen, what you said is that it would be impossible to DNA sequence from an RNA template by PCR. And what I'm saying is that was incorrect, what you said.
Okay.
Yeah, because I just so for people listening, what you said, and of course we're going to go through this, we're recording it. So that was incorrect what you said, that you couldn't DNA sequence because it's an RNA template in PCR, and that is incorrect what you said.
Okay, we're at 15 minutes now.
Okay.
So I think what we need to do, so the important thing is that if you are going to give us now in the World Integrity Project a sample of the virus, and I'm happy to give you the labs.
Are you aware you can actually obtain it? If you're a credible lab, you can obtain it from various organisations. You can send them an email and say, we're a so-and-so university, and they will send you a sample.
So you know what, we've been asked, for example, there's been letters to the National Virus Research Centre in Dublin, and to ask them for some of the virus, and no one has been able to provide it, but we'll get it from you.
To be fair though,
I'm delighted that you have a copy of the virus, because the big issue is what are people diagnosing with COVID-19? But just to go back, the whole point of this is, why are so many people dying and the clinical trials and been harmed and suffering when with one death or 25 deaths, the clinical trials should have been stopped? And we have tens of thousands of deaths. And
no, we don't.
On the Pfizer clinical trial, over 70% of the women that got pregnant on the trials, their unborn babies died. Now, people listening...
No, they didn't. That's an urban myth.
So Dr. Luke McFarlane from Australia, who was the head gynecologist, he did numbers on his hospital, and he worked out that 70% of the women, so normally you would have that sadly the babies in a pregnancy of 100 women that was pregnant, between 5 to 16 of the 100 pregnant women, their unborn babies would die. But he tracked in Australia, and over 70 of the unborn babies in vaccinated mothers died. Now, normally people wouldn't eat chicken, you wouldn't eat a salad, or you wouldn't eat an egg. You would be told to be careful. It's unconscionable to be injecting pregnant women.
Right. Okay. Can I actually speak to that point? So, no, that again is, I'm afraid, a complete and utter lie. And in fact, it's a very, very dangerous lie. So the safety of the vaccines has been looked at in pregnancy in a lot of detail. And given that we've had 16 billion... excuse me.
Professor Cahill, please let him finish.
No, just which trial has been looked in? Just which trial? The Pfizer one?
Given that we have given 16 plus billion doses worldwide, and there has been no increase in stillbirths, birth deformities or problems during pregnancy over 2 years and 16 billion doses. So one Australian obstetrician making an unfounded claim with no apparent data to back it up is completely irrelevant, I'm afraid. However, all of the clinical studies...
Can I just to intervene? Are you saying that you're taking responsibility in law for that statement, yeah? Are you taking... responsibility, because saying things that are not true, and I'm happy to correct it if what I'm saying is not true. So there is lawful consequences. No, I'm just saying, I'm just giving you a piece of information for your own protection.
Every single study that has looked at pregnancy and the COVID vaccines has found no safety problems at all. Not one study, not one published study.
No, the Pfizer trial, the data was published.
The Pfizer trial did not look at pregnancy. There were no pregnant women at the start of the Pfizer trial. You do not do phase 3 trials on pregnant women. You just don't do it.
But 272 women got pregnant during the trial after the injection. And do you know, and that is well reported, do you know how many of them lost their babies? Over 70%.
Exactly the same rate as is normal for pregnant women. Yes. I'm afraid that, trying to make fake claims. I mean, this one has been debunked many times.
So I'm happy to stand over what I'm saying. Yeah. So I'm happy that we can have a,
so you are happy then to admit that you are wrong, because I can easily find the data that proves you are wrong. And it's very
okay. We are at
So I'm happy. Can I just say that I am happy to say that over 200 women got pregnant on the trial, and it is published that 70 of their unborn babies died. Normally, the death rate in pregnancy, sadly, is between 5% and 16%. And I'm happy.
Okay, well, what I would suggest to people is if...
You're both muted. Now, we've passed 20 minutes and we're going to move on to the next section. You can carry on the open discussion after we move into the second segment. Okay?
Okay.
And listen, if you tell me the second segment, because I only really got asked to do this in the last couple of hours, so I don't have the titles of the segments.
Absolutely. It's sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. Is it the vaccine, or is it COVID, or is it something else?
Perfect.
Okay. It's your turn actually to go first. You have 5 minutes.
Yes. So I suppose the numbers. So again, right? Whoever injects someone, whoever carries out a medical intervention, is lawfully liable. So if you cause harm, like we know, there were doctors have caused harm, that the doctor or the person who's injecting, the man or woman, has to, for every medical intervention, for each one, look at whoever they're looking at and perform whether the intervention is going to harm them, cause suffering, kill them, or if there is a range of interventions that can benefit them. So we know that this so-called influenza-like illness with Dr. Zelenko, for example, in February of 2020, that he had 799 elderly people who had those symptoms. He gave them Nobel Prize-winning hydroxychloroquine and zinc, but also it was well known 20 years ago, because I've been studying this, that if people get proper supplements of vitamin D and C, that they won't, and it's been shown in many clinical trials in the years since, that you don't actually need to inject. And then if you go to how many people have died, so that is, what are the options for people, particularly the elderly? And hydroxychloroquine has a half-life of 3 weeks. It's on the World Health Organization essential medicine of the world because it's safe and effective. It's been around for decades. And ivermectin won a Nobel Prize in 2015. And it is also on the safest medicines in the world. So that if somebody is worried, the doctors cannot do harm. So they actually have to give interventions that cause the least harm. So there is vitamin D, vitamin C, ivermectin, Nobel Prize winning hydroxychloroquine, safest medicines, one of the safest medicines with the least number of adverse events. So if I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a PhD, but if I was doing it, I would be giving people those prevention and treatments. And also hydroxychloroquine will say you can give it in a the preventative dose is 1 tablet every 3 weeks. And that will protect, we'll say, the elderly, once every 3 weeks over the period where people get flu-like illnesses, so the winter, we'll say. So what we then have in these clinical trials is we have over 30,000 deaths on the clinical trial. So normally a clinical trial is stopped with 1 death or maximally 25 to 50 deaths. And so the big question is, why are these clinical trials not been stopped? And for example, in Ireland, we did an analysis in March and April of 2021 of the deaths in the care homes in Ireland. And this was done with Health Freedom Ireland. And there's one care home where there were over 51 beautiful elderly people. And on average in that care home, 2 people died per year. And people went into that care home and injected all 51 of them. And within 48 hours, 8 of them had died. Within 2 weeks, 19 of the 51 had died. And within 5 weeks, 26, more than half of those beautiful elderly people had died. We did an analysis of 10 care homes in Ireland, and they were injected on different days. And we did an analysis where more than 10 people died. And as we see in open VAERS, if people are going to die, they die, 1 in 4 people die within 48 hours. And the correlation, it's absolutely correlated down to more than 30 standard deviations. So the date of the deaths and the hours are within the time of the injection. And we got the death certs and we confirmed it all as it was reported in the media. So just in 10 care homes in Ireland, even in that one care home with more than half. So, I mean, what people have to imagine is that, one Saturday, they were there with all of their friends. And 2 weeks later, they had gone to 19 funerals. And people are still injecting. So that one care home in January 2020 should have been enough in the whole world to stop the clinical trials. And the deaths are absolutely correlated. And with Health Freedom Ireland, that information was sent to every member of Parliament in Ireland. And in the World Freedom Alliance, we sent notices of harm and death to 40,000 notices, including to all prime ministers and leaders of countries. And I sent myself notices for harm and death in Ireland to the President, the Attorney General, and the key people in Ireland, including on the Immunisation Advisory Committee, right? So the thing is,
that's
I'll just finish
5.5 minutes, if you can finish up, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the thing is, we cannot go around killing people. Doesn't matter whether you wear a white coat or not. And we have over 30,000 deaths on these clinical trials. And when there is safe and effective prevention and treatment for the symptoms, it is immoral and against the Hippocratic Oath and unlawful to carry on injecting and causing suffering, adverse events and death.
Thank you very much. Dr. Botley, rebuttal for 5 minutes.
Yeah, so firstly, that was absolutely nothing to do with the topic under discussion, which is obviously one issue. Secondly, I did find the data about pregnancies during the Pfizer clinical trials. There are actually 89 pregnancies in the phase 3 trials, and there were actually fewer miscarriages in the vaccine group than in the placebo. So if anything, the vaccine actually reduces the risk of miscarriage. So that's just a follow-up from there. I also then wanted to address the point about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. So hydroxychloroquine has no studies at all that show it does anything at all for COVID, not even one study. So hydroxychloroquine can basically be ignored. It does nothing. You might as well give people water. As for ivermectin, there have been quite a few trials now out there. A few of them, most of them have shown no effect whatsoever on infection, on the development of disease, on the severity of symptoms, on the rate of death or anything else. So most of them have shown no effect. A handful of studies have shown ivermectin having an effect. However, what is worth noting is that pretty much every single one of those studies has been retracted by the journal that published it, because in the vast majority of cases, there's been scientific fraud. Data has been made up, data has been fabricated, and so on. So ivermectin also has no impact. Yes, it won a Nobel Prize. It is good at curing parasites, treating parasites. I use it for my sheep. It treats parasites, gut parasites, it treats sheep scab. It does not treat COVID, never has, never will. Vitamin D, vitamin C, always useful to be topped up. It is always good to have enough vitamin D and vitamin C in your system, always. And certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, we can end up being a little bit short of vitamin D. But taking additional vitamin C and vitamin D will have no impact whatsoever on COVID progression. And anyone who tells you it does is almost invariably trying to sell you vitamin C or vitamin D. Now, moving on to the other bits. Now, obviously, I had prepared for the sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, and it veered more onto care home deaths. So again, most I think of what was said there was waffle. What must be remembered is that vaccines, they're very, very effective. They will reduce your chance of infection. They will reduce the severity of symptoms. They will produce a very, very effective immune response. However, infection is multifactorial. The things that govern whether you get infected and whether you get sick there are many, many factors. So you can have a vaccine, a very effective vaccine, but if you put yourself in a situation where you are exposed to a very, very high level of virus, you will get infected. Because a vaccine is not a magic shield. It does not protect you 100%. What it does is it means at lower levels of exposure, you are more likely to be protected. Okay, and so that's what we've got to remember. Now, what you've also got to then remember about very, very old people in care homes is if COVID gets in, then they are very often in an enclosed space. They are exposed to high levels of that pathogen. It is not just the flu. It is very, very serious. And when they become ill, they then start spreading it on. And so a highly infectious disease like this can spread rapidly in something like a care home. Now, of course, when you get older, your immune system becomes weaker at protecting yourself. You lose the ability over life of being able to make new T cells, new reactive cells, B cells, T cells, all being able to make new ones against a new disease. You lose that ability. Now, what this means is when you're given a vaccine, the vaccine is not quite as effective as it would be in a younger person, especially in a child. But it's still effective. It still works, but a vaccine in an elderly person is going to be less effective than in a younger person. So what you've got is you've got a location, a care home, where the virus can circulate really, really easily. You've got a population who are frail, who will succumb to all of the COVID symptoms far more quickly. So the autoimmunity, the diabetes, the cardiac, the circulatory issues, those all have a greater impact and are more likely to be fatal in an older person. Giving the vaccine is not 100% proof. Now, studies in older people have shown it reduces infections, it reduces symptoms, it reduces mortality. But you will still get increased mortality during a pandemic in a situation such as a care home. Now, if you didn't vaccinate those older people, then it would be carnage. And again, you brought up the thing, doctors must not cause harm. You brought up again this untruth about 30,000 deaths from the vaccine. That's nonsense. In the UK, there are something like 80 deaths with a link to the vaccines. And that is it. And that is from something like 200 million doses. Okay, so 200 million doses. Yeah.
Yeah, can we, okay. Thank you. Right. We will now move on to open discussion where you both can discuss what you were just talking about. Professor, would you like to go first and rebut anything that he said?
Yeah, sure. So just for people to look at, they can look at it while they're on OPEN, openvaers.org, OPENVAERS.org, and that is recognized as collating in the world the deaths on the clinical trials.
Yeah.
And just on the
Now,
1st of October,
now you
there
see,
are 1,569 COVID vaccine reported deaths.
You see, because again, you see, this is a misunderstanding that many lay people would make. I would not expect a professor to make such a basic mistake. You see, what you're doing is you are making the assumption that the reporting systems like theirs is a catalogue of adverse effects. It's not. Now, for one thing, OpenVAERS is a collation of reporting systems, so we can pretty much ignore that. It's basically like a media collation. You can ignore that completely.
No, because they're actually, the figures are broken down. You know, I'm president of the World Doctors Alliance, and we actually verify the results.
Yes.
And we have them. There's 130,000 doctors, so they're actually analysed independently from, particularly and assessed from the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the USA. And we've been tracking them. Somebody has actually been doing it on a voluntary basis, and we get the data, and then we cross-check.
Except that the data that you're getting is not adverse events. It's not. What it is things reported to the reporting system. That is not an adverse event.
So I studied this, right?
For example,
I ran clinical trials, right? So the thing is that if there is a death under law on a clinical trial, and we know that there is huge underreporting of the deaths, right?
No,
but
there's not.
The ones that are actually reported on the system in relation to the official government-approved numbers.
No. So you see, the thing is, you're still misunderstanding. So a reporting system is where both people and professionals can report things that happen after a vaccine. Now, firstly, there are a good many false and malicious reports. So there's the quite famous case where someone said their skin turned green, they ripped out their clothing, and they developed super strength.
Talking about deaths.
As a result, let me just finish what I'm saying.
It's important. I'm only talking about deaths. Sorry now, Graham. No, there is a lawful process, right? So there's a lawful process. So a death must be reported properly, because any death on a clinical trial, it's not the same as reporting an adverse event. It's actually reported to the manufacturer, whoever in that nation has the licensing authority, and if there is a death, it actually has to be confirmed.
If you had actually let me finish what I'm saying, I would have said that firstly, many of the events recorded in things like theirs are malicious reports. Now, the other thing you have to remember is that you have temporal association. So if we suddenly vaccinate 1 million people, someone will die shortly after the vaccine, because they would have died shortly after the vaccine anyway. Simply by the laws of chance, the chances of someone dying within, say, a month of a vaccine are high.
Because, so Graham, you know all the athletes that have myocarditis and pericarditis, are you saying that that's not related? The sudden adult death related? You're saying, are you saying that?
Yes. And so that has been examined. The athletes who are having cardiac issues are having the same rate of cardiac issues as for several decades in the past that it's been looked at. And that's been proven. And in fact, what I also have here, if you let me finish again, what I also have in front of me...
No, I just want to say, because you know your words have power, and also there is a local responsibility to be truthful. You are saying there is no increase, we'll say, in 30-year-old, 40-year-old people with sudden adult death.
No. And in fact, what I have here is I have the ONS analysis of that very fact in front of me. So this is the Office of National Statistics who are responsible for collating this data. And it says there is no evidence of a change in the number of cardiac-related deaths or deaths from any cause after a vaccination in young people aged 12 to 29 in England. There is no change. Things like sudden arrhythmic death syndrome are happening at exactly the same rate it has happened at for decades. And indeed, going back to 1917, when it was first described, the rate is the same. There is no increase after vaccination.
That's okay. Can I just spot that?
Yeah.
So I published a paper in 2006 about dilated cardiomyopathy, where following an infection, the immune system can be activated, and that activation can then target organs. And it was a PhD student of mine. The first name is Horn. The last name is Cahill. So that was published in 2006 after 3 or 4 years' work. And in 2020, before any of these products or so-called vaccines were on the market, I provided a whole lot of scientific publications to predict that if they used mRNA, particularly the ones that I was aware that they were considering, that people would get the injection or vaccine, the immune response would activate, and within weeks or months or short numbers of years, the immune system would then target the organs, and the people would die from sudden adult death, cardiac arrest, and or sepsis in the years to follow. And I did this a year before, and that turns out, I'm afraid, if anyone is on my Telegram channel, I put up a video of someone walking through, I think it was Melbourne in Australia, where they have hundreds of people in their, like, teenagers, 20s, 30s and 40s of people who have literally dropped dead from myocarditis.
No, again, you see, anecdote is completely irrelevant. So you say you predicted that there would be an immune response to mRNA. You say you're an immunologist. Tell me, what immune response against the mRNA are you predicting specifically? What cells are going to respond to it? How are they going to respond to it? What receptors?
Yeah, so the thing is, right, what in sudden adult death, right?
Yeah, so what immune response are you saying will cause this this sudden arrhythmic death syndrome several months afterwards? Please tell me which cells, which receptors, which molecules, which markers.
So, I mean, we've written publications on it, right? So,
yeah,
I mean,
so it'll be easy then. It'll be easy for you to tell me.
But I think what's important is, right, is that the symptoms are, because you know what we're worried about, right? This isn't an academic issue, right? What I came out in 2020 was to say that people would start to be breathless. And depending on where the product of the injection or the mRNA was in there, if it was in their heart or if it was in their pancreas,
it doesn't get to either.
No. So I just tell you how it works for people listening, right? So if it's mRNA and it's converted, because the immune system reacts to around 9 or 12 amino acids, right? Various strands of the immune system. But if that is embedded in a tissue like the heart muscle, the immune system
Sorry. What is embedded? The mRNA.
The peptide, right? So if the mRNA goes to the heart muscle cells, and if it is then expressed as a peptide, the immune system responds to 9 to 12 amino acids, right? But why they will start to appear breathless, which I explained in 2020, was that the immune system is wrongly primed and unlawfully and immorally primed to put a foreign object in those bodies. The immune system will then see that as a foreign object in the heart tissue, and then it will start to kill the heart tissue. And people will then start to get breathless, and the heart will enlarge because the immune system is attacking their own body, and then the heart gets weaker and weaker. And then if they're not engaged in athletic activity, they may die in their sleep. And if they are engaged in... And you know what? I said that in 2020 and provided the information on Del Bigtree that people, sadly, if they were sporty, would drop dead. And I'm afraid there has been an increase in athletes and sadly young people dropping dead.
There's no increase, nothing. So firstly, I think what I need to do is I need to educate you a little bit on... Excuse me. Sorry, can I finish? I need to educate you a little bit on how the immune system works here. So the mRNA that we inject in is taken up by cells in the muscle. So it's surrounded by a lipid, and this lipid is taken up by the cell membranes in the muscle cells, and it's taken up by a few million cells. Now that sounds a lot, but a few million cells, if I were to put them into a lump, you're talking something that could fit 100 times on your little fingernail. So a million cells is not a lot. Now, when the mRNA gets into those million cells, those cells do start to produce the protein, and it is broken down into 8 to 12 amino acid sections.
By the way, I published on nanoparticles, right?
Yeah,
I don't know, have you published on nanoparticles?
Yeah, I know.
No,
Can I finish what I'm saying?
Because those nanoparticles go to other organs. So they do not... Yeah,
sorry,
so you're misrepresenting it there. They don't just go to the muscle. They go to the brain, and they also go to the heart. No, what you're saying...
Professor, could you please allow, Dr. Botley to get points across first?
Yeah, but wait a minute. I've actually published on this, right?
Professor,
and what he's saying is not correct.
I'm moderating this debate, so can we please just go back and forth, okay?
No, it's fine, but what he's saying is not correct.
Okay, and then let him say it first, and then you can come in and rebut it. Okay, please.
Yeah,
Dr. Bartley, continue.
So when these lipid nanoparticles get into the arm, they don't leave the arm. They are just taken up by cells. The cells, these million or few million cells, start producing the protein, the peptides that shows it to the immune system. The immune system does kill those cells. That is true. But that's what we want to happen. Now, killing a few million cells that have this mRNA expression of the viral peptides, that's fine, that's good, because that primes the immune system to then fight the infection wherever it goes. Now, I know what she's going to say. She's going to say something like, study on nanoparticles went to liver, etc. There have been a study where they took rats and they injected a vast number of nanoparticles into them, empty nanoparticles, which is important, and a few of them ended up in places like the liver and things. Now, firstly, we're not rats. Secondly, if you inject vast amounts of empty nanoparticles, then you will get it. But if you inject the vaccines don't go anywhere else. And I know that she's going to come back on and she's going to say, I've published on it. Well, I'm sorry, she may well have done, but anything she's published that says they go anywhere else is wrong. It's not correct.
Professor, please rebut that.
So I'm afraid, but I'm happy we can discuss it afterwards. These lipid nanoparticles are known to go to the brain and to other tissues. Now, the other thing is, what I just have to say is, in the United Kingdom, the excess deaths are 1,200 excess deaths a month. So what does Dr. Botley say about that? And in Ireland, we have, just so you know, the number of babies. And then maybe just to go back on that, there's a Japanese biodistribution study that confirms in the rat study that these nanoparticles...
In the rats, yeah.
But also, can I just say that we had in Ireland, I looked through the deaths myself, we had more babies die in 1 month this year than in 10 months in 2015. So there is an increase in death, and there's 1,200 increase per month of excess deaths in the United Kingdom.
Yes, there are indeed, and we know why that is. It's due to COVID. COVID is a very dangerous virus. I told you this earlier. And given that we have quite a long list now of sequelae of long-term conditions, if you get COVID and then that damages the heart, and we know it damages the heart, we know it causes autoimmunity, we know it can increase diabetes, we know it can cause circulatory issues. Now, if you get those and it damages the heart and it damages your immune system, then you are more prone to infection with other things. We know COVID damages your immune system. So when you have a pandemic that is infecting, I think at any one time, there's something like 1 in 50 people in the UK have COVID. And we know that there are repeat infections, even with vaccination. And so even with vaccination, we are seeing an increase in deaths from the pandemic. Now, had we not vaccinated, that increase in deaths would have been significantly higher. Excess deaths would have been huge. And as for babies dying, we know that COVID during pregnancy is very, very bad. And in fact, one of the major causes of loss of pregnancy over the past couple of years has been COVID infection in the unvaccinated. And one of the big problems is people come out and say the vaccines are dangerous for pregnant women. Pregnant women are frightened. If they are not scientists, they don't necessarily understand. They refuse the vaccine and then they get COVID and they lose their baby. And it has been happening.
So can I just respond? First of all, a piece of information. In 2019, 2020, 2021, 0 unborn babies died from COVID in the world. Number one. Okay?
That's wrong.
0. And so the other thing I just have to ask you, because I've been studying coronaviruses and pandemics since the 2002, 2003. So would you think, do you know how many people died in the world in the first coronavirus pandemic, 2002, 2003, without any intervention?
I'm sure you're going to have a figure that you're going to pluck out of somewhere.
So this is now the outcome if you, this was the pandemic, another pandemic declared. So it was in the whole world, this is World Health Organization studies, less than 800 people in the whole world died, right? That was then without any intervention, and if there was COVID and long COVID, it would have been the same. So it was 1 in 8 million people. And the same number of deaths equivalent in 2019, 2020 up until March was the same numbers, and no children and no unborn babies.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I'm just looking at a study here that for every 1,000 women who had a positive COVID test went on to have a stillbirth, compared to 3.4 women per 1,000 who didn't have COVID. So you're talking more than 5 women per 1,000 are having a stillbirth caused by COVID. Okay, and that is across America, and that is based on a study of 340,000 women. So if you multiply that 5 by 340, you are talking at least 2,000 babies were stillborn because of COVID in that study. So to say that none were stillborn because of COVID is completely and utterly false. And this is the problem. You see, it's very, very easy to say no babies were stillborn because of COVID. It's easy to say that. It's easy to make that claim. I have in front of me a study showing that 5 babies per 1,000 women died.
There was no...
Because... Yeah, but you're saying that with no evidence. You're saying no babies died. Prove it. Tell me a link, tell me a study that showed that no babies died from COVID, because I can share you a link that shows that 5 out of every 1,000 women had a stillbirth because of COVID infection. Okay? So the thing is, and this is the big problem with the stance that you have taken. You're making various claims. You're saying you published on nanoparticles and they get into the brain. No one has ever shown them in the brain. No one has ever shown any evidence in the brain. But you're claiming that it happens. Okay.
The
only
study. Can I just ask you one thing?
Dr. Botley, let her have a little rebuttal as well, please.
First of all, how does an influenza or a pathophysiology of the respiratory tract? So if you go back to 2019, 2020. Worldwide, they were saying there was no issue with children and pregnant women and unborn babies. So how does influenza virus lead to a miscarriage?
I'm not certain influenza virus does.
No, coronavirus, influenza-like symptoms. How does that lead to a miscarriage? Did they investigate? Was there an EM?
Because again, you see, this is the problem. I've had this discussion with school children who understand that this virus does not just infect lung tissue. This is not a purely respiratory virus. This virus is capable of infecting any cell with the ACE2 receptor. It is capable of infecting any cell. If a cell has the ACE2 receptor, the virus can infect it. If it can infect it, it causes pathophysiology. And because you have a systemic response to this virus, if you have immune dysregulation, you get damage. Now, one of the big problems with COVID and one of the big killers with COVID is what's something called cytokine storm. Now, for those listeners who are unaware of that, that's when the body's immune response gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and it isn't reined in by T regulatory cells. And this massive amount of cytokine that normally is used to help drive the immune response can drive the immune response to such a level that you cause damage. And we know that this virus disrupts your immune response. We know it.
Yes, please,
so
Professor.
Obviously in May 2020, I was giving the information about the cytokine storm. But I think for everyone listening, right, if this virus was so dangerous, there was no increase in deaths in 2020 in Ireland or in the world because of the virus alone. There's only been, and there was no spike in baby deaths or miscarriage deaths. There's only been a spike since the injection. And I was the one with Dr. Alexandra Herrion-Claudet and Judy Mikovich that were describing the cytokine storm because zero mRNA technology were ever licensed. So how come, if this virus was so dangerous, that we didn't have a death spike in 2019, 2020?
Well, I mean, to be honest, if I'm absolutely honest, I have no particular reason to believe that that's what you've seen. And so what I thought I would do, let's have a quick...
I have the numbers, by the way. We were tracking them from...
Yeah, well, I would actually rather check them from a reputable source. So fatal deaths in Ireland. So there are publications. A severe wave of COVID disease affected Ireland in the first 3 months of 2021.
We're talking about 2020.
Six stillbirths were observed in the Irish population because of placental insufficiency as a result of SARS-CoV-2 placentitis. So, I've already found with a very quick
We're talking about
PubMed
2020. So in the world, in 2020, there was no increase in death. In fact, in Ireland, it was the lowest deaths in the previous 10 years.
Right, so basically what you're saying is, if you look at...
Graham, can I finish and then you can answer? If this virus and COVID was so serious for all of 2020, why would there be no increase in deaths in the world? And in Ireland had the lowest death rate in all of 2020 in the last 10 years.
Right, so what you're doing, you see, is you're cherry picking. It's like basically me saying, well, in Leeds on a Thursday when it's raining, there's only one person stabbed. Therefore, knife crime is not a problem in the world. And the problem with cherry picking data like that is you're basically saying before we knew much about COVID 2020. There are some stats that you think
19 2020, right? That's not cherry picking. This is supposed to be a seasonal flu-like illness. And if it was so severe and the adverse events of COVID, then everyone in the world would have got it 2019, 2020. And there was no increase in deaths in the world in those years. That's not cherry picking.
Right. Okay. So
we're coming up to 25 minutes of the open discussion. Do you want to wrap up what you're... would you like to answer her?
Yeah. Well, there is one thing, because there was a study called the CAP COVID study that was published in the Journal of Human Reproduction, and that covers the period between the 21st of May and the 31st December 2020. So the exact period she was talking about, and it found that the rate of miscarriage from women who were infected was 14% compared to 8% in those uninfected. So there is a study covering that specific period done by UCL that shows there was a significant increase in miscarriage. So I'm afraid that she said earlier that, words have power, and telling people that it is not a danger to pregnant women is very, very, very dangerous. And that does make me really quite angry.
To be fair, can I just get back? I said the average miscarriage rate in the world, if 100 women pregnant, is between 5 and 16%. That is the average, right? In the Pfizer study and in Australia, the miscarriage or stillbirth, the death of unborn children was 70%. So you said that study was 14%. That is the average rate of all.
No. But you cannot collate worldwide statistics for something like miscarriage.
Because there is a miscarriage rate depending on how many weeks you're pregnant. That's well known.
Yes, but it has to be done by country, because it also depends on prenatal care. It depends on nutrition. It depends on genetics. It depends on...
Yes, but you can actually look at all the age and all the factors, and it's between 8 and 16%. That's the rate.
Which is why the study I had just quoted you found that in uninfected was 8%, infected 14%.
No, but that's the normal background rate, between 5 and 16%.
No, you're still not understanding. The background rate was 8%. Not between this and this, it was 8% for uninfected. It was 14% for infected. There was an increase with infection. Okay.
Okay, we're going to stop the open discussion now.
Can I just finish up and say
you can in a second. You can in a second.
I just want to make one point, and then
you can in a second. Let me just get a point across first, please.
Just the last point is, right, that these unborn babies, 70% in the Australian study of unborn babies that were otherwise healthy died only in the pregnant women, whereas the normal background rate of non-injected pregnant women was the normal rate of between 5 and 16% in that hospital over a year. And that is unconscionable, because those babies, we are talking about an intervention that is killing unborn babies.
Yeah, thank you. Professor, you can wrap up in a second, okay? We're going to now wrap up this open discussion, all right? I want to thank both of you for coming. Professor Dolores Cahill, thank you very much for coming. Forgive me for calling you doctor earlier. That was out of stupidity, not
takes a lot of work to be a professor, so thank you.
Yeah, of course. And Dr. Graham Botley as well, thank you for coming. I would like both of you now to present like a final argument wrap-up of the night. You have 3 to 5 minutes. Professor Cahill, please, you can go first.
Well, thank you, first of all, for hosting the debate, and thank you for Dr. Graham Botley for coming on. I suppose for me it is that if this thing was supposed to be a flu, I've been following all these pandemics for 20 years. Vitamin D and C, zinc, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin would have been shown would have prevented any kind of symptoms. And Dr. Zeb Zelenko had 799 elderly people in New York, and all of them survived in February, March by just getting the Zelenko protocol, which included hydroxychloroquine and zinc. And it turns out that when you have a approved and regulated intervention like that, that you can actually give it, that was like a clinical trial of 800 participants, and they all survived. All of them lived. So I suppose and then in the mRNA technology particularly, none of any of the clinical trials over decades were ever licensed before 2020, because in the animal studies, in some studies, all the animals died. So what has been happening is an undermining of the clinical trial process, because every life is valuable, and doctors and regulators and politicians are they're harming people. It's actually a criminal offense to allow a clinical trial to progress for months and years in different countries in the world, when the harm, suffering, adverse events and death far outweigh what the symptoms are. And, it's our job as scientists we have an obligation under the law to prevent harm and death. Everybody has. And there has been an increase in sudden adult death. There has been an increase in death of pregnancy. And it is directly, like in the old folks' homes, the statistical correlation between the date of the injection and the deaths was plus or minus 32 standard deviations. So it was absolutely statistically correlated. And that was published and it was sent to every member of parliament. So normally a clinical trial is stopped with between 1 death or 25 deaths or maximally 50 deaths. And we have had deaths on these clinical trials. People are dropping dead of sudden adult death syndrome, which I explained in 2020, as did other people. But the process that if the immune system, if mRNA is injected, why the animals in the animal study died is this is seen as something foreign. The immune system starts to try and get rid of it. And if it is in organs in the body, the immune system will attack those organs and they will present with symptoms like heart attack or sepsis. And when in May 2020, when I described all the publications and my interviews, I was very happy were watched by millions of people, that I was saying people would present weeks and months and maybe years after with unusual symptoms like dropping dead or sepsis because of the mRNA injection. And there has been an increase in deaths. And it's really our job in the World Freedom Alliance and the World Doctors Alliance. I've been doing this voluntarily. And, because if we don't stop deaths on clinical trials, it will reduce the bond between scientists and the medical profession and the regulators and everybody, because people will not trust us. And there is statistical evidence. I've looked at the death certs, I've looked at the data. People have not been given full and informed consent. And whoever does the injection is engaging in harming people by giving them an injection without full and informed consent. And then, those people who trusted the media and the doctors, when they get the adverse events, they are not being listened to around the world in the hospital system. And they are becoming breathless and they're having seizures and their family members are literally dropping dead. And it is a much higher rate with people who have been injected by the this so-called COVID-19 injection, particularly the mRNA technology. And it's wrong and it should be stopped. It should have been stopped months ago.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Graham, would you like to finish off?
So I listened to that summary, and really that highlights the main problem that we have in that what was that last summary was wrong from start to finish. Pretty much everything that was said there was wrong. Ivermectin doesn't work, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, vitamin D doesn't work, etc. We've also got the lies about the increase in sudden adult death syndrome. I found on the ONS website, if you search ONS, and SADS, you can find for yourself that there is no increase. And just because someone says there is, doesn't mean there is. And that's the important thing. And it also shows the problem with a certain amount of scientific illiteracy. Professor or not, the fact that she said, it introduces something foreign into your body that the body attacks. Well, of course it does. That is what a vaccine is. It says to your body, here is what you need to attack, go and get it. But without causing any of the significant symptoms that this infection causes. And so that's the problem. It sounds deadly. It sounds dangerous. We're putting something deadly into your body that your immune system will attack. Well, yes. And that's the thing. Because of the way it's phrased, it scares people. It makes people think the vaccines are dangerous. The vaccines are not dangerous. Nothing in life is 100% safe. Nothing in life, I found out apparently 38 people a year or so die in the UK from getting into bed. Now that is more than the deaths related to the vaccine. But at the same time, the vaccine has probably saved something like 200,000 lives in the UK. So she started by saying, when you inject someone, do no harm. Not injecting is doing harm. The vaccines are incredibly safe. We know they're incredibly safe. We know that the disease is dangerous. And I think, to be honest, you can't really say much more than that, because that's reality. That's life. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much. I let all the discussions run on a bit long, so, because we hadn't actually prepared for the professor. So we're ending. That's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Now, I'm happy to stay on as long as you want and happy to answer questions. And thank you for hosting the debate so elegantly as well. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me on.
Of course, not a problem.